Thanks, everyone. So I'm just going to talk you through some research that we've carried out recently about women as volunteers in sport. I'm just going to start by explaining a little bit about who women in sport are, in case you've not heard of us before. I'll then cover how we did the research, what it covered, what our main findings were, and then hopefully some suggestions for those of you who work with volunteers about how you might be able to apply some of this research. So, Women in Sport are a charity, and our vision is a society where gender equality exists in every sphere. So that's quite a big vision. And our mission in particular is about advancing gender equality through and within sport. So that's by empowering women and girls through sport and through transforming the sports sector. So that then converts into two main goals that we're working towards achieving. So the first one is about empowering women and girls through sport. And this one focuses a lot on getting more women and girls active, but it's also about recognizing those benefits that sport can bring to women and girls to help develop skills such as teamwork, resilience, confidence, etc. Our second goal is about transforming the sports sector. So this one's about women and girls. We want them to have equal opportunities within the sports sector. So whether that's through volunteering in sport, by leading in sport, or by working in sport. This goal also encompasses our work around the visibility of women in the media, for example, around the levels of investment into women's sport, and also levels of sponsorship in women's sport. So at Women in Sport, we support the sports sector and beyond to ensure that women have equal access to sport. All of our work is based on research, and while there's lots of research out there about volunteering generally, there's not so much about women as volunteers. So we therefore decided we wanted to try and fill this gap in knowledge and carry out some research into this area. So with funding from Sport England, we commissioned Leeds Beckett University to carry out this research. To look at an in-depth picture of women's volunteering. So what are their experiences of volunteering, what are their motivations, and what are their barriers? So the research was led by Dr. Leanne Norman of Leeds Beckett University, with quite a lot of other researchers involved as well. It started with a literature review where we gathered research that's already out there, just to really make sure that we're not just repeating research that's been done before, to really make sure that we're filling that gap in knowledge. We then moved on to a qualitative project. So we undertook 54 in-depth interviews, mainly with volunteers in sport. So they were also held with women and men, so that we could ensure that we're really recognising what are the issues that women in particular are experiencing. So 24 interviews were carried out with men and women in the traditional sports sector, so the core sports. And these consisted of tennis, boxing, netball, cycling, rugby, and then also a range of disability sports, including table tennis, swimming, and football. So we wanted to include a range of sports where there's high numbers of men participating, high numbers of women participating, and also those sports where you might consider them to be more gender neutral, such as tennis. So participants were a spread of ages from 20s through to 70s, and they were also been volunteering for a range of times, for a range of length of times. So we also talked to volunteers within a more informal sports setting, and for this project we picked parkrun for that. So again, it was a mix of ages of people that we spoke to, but they've generally been volunteering in sport for less time than those that were involved in the more core sports. We also then wanted to compare sport with the non-sport sector. So we conducted 15 interviews with people who are volunteering in other areas, such as in a charity shop, in mentoring organisations, in youth organisations, and women's groups. So we really wanted to speak to as wide a range of volunteers as possible. And we had a good geographical spread. So there were volunteers from the Midlands, Yorkshire, and London in the South East. However, only 6 of the participants were from a black or minority ethnic background, and the rest were white British. So I think it's really important that we acknowledge that actually women's experiences will differ depending on their own experiences and their characteristics, and this includes ethnicity. So I'm going to run through some of the themes from the research in relation to women, and this is by no means everything that came up in the research. And I also want to highlight that we didn't cover volunteering in mass sporting events, so we didn't cover volunteering, for example, at the Olympics or in the Commonwealth Games. So just to start with the non-sport sector, what we found out from the literature review. So we found that there are no gender differences between men and women volunteering on a regular basis in terms of formal volunteering. So this is like giving unpaid help to groups, clubs, or organizations. But there were differences in informal volunteering. So this is about giving unpaid help to an individual. And 62% of women were volunteered in informal locations compared to 56% of men. There are also differences in terms of roles carried out by men and women in non-sports volunteering. So, for example, women are more likely to undertake caring roles, and men are more likely to represent others. And then moving on to sports volunteering in particular. So sports volunteering attracts a less diverse population than volunteering generally, and they reflect the profile of sports participants. So they tend to be male, non-disabled, white, and from a higher socioeconomic background. 30% of men volunteer compared to only 14% of women. And again, there are real differences in terms of gendered allocation of roles. So men are more likely than women to occupy decision-making positions, such as a chairperson or supervisory positions. And men are also more likely to undertake coaching roles, whereas women are more likely to undertake sport roles, such as kind of behind-the-scenes roles, such as catering or looking after the children. So the literature review found that the primary motivation for both sexes to volunteer is enjoyment. So passion for sport is a real key driver for getting people to volunteer in sport, and this is true for women as well as men. And then linked with the passion for sport is the importance of family in driving volunteering, with many people starting to volunteer due to the participation of friends and family. And I'll come on to that a bit later on. The literature does, however, highlight some gender differences in terms of motivations to volunteer in sport. So men are generally more motivated by their interest in sport, by the perks that come from volunteering in the sport, and also by the opportunity to support their community. Women are more likely to volunteer in sport relating to their personal or career development, and also the opportunity to develop their social networks, as well as due to influence of family. And this was partly confirmed by our research. So we found that women tend not to talk about the extrinsic rewards that come from volunteering, and that their intentions were very much focused on the intrinsic rewards. And we found that parkrun in particular provided more opportunities for volunteers to make and reaffirm their social connections, much more so than the traditional or core sports. So there did appear to be a greater alignment between the mass market or parkrun organisational values with women than there was for the core sports. So as I've already discussed, gender stereotyping and discrimination was identified as an issue in the literature review, in the relation in particular to the allocation of roles. And we did also come across both discrimination and stereotyping in our research. So with many of the women, particularly in the traditional sports, experience this. And this was particularly noticeable in those sports that have a history of male participation and leadership. And women in particular as coaches really felt that discrimination, and they really felt that they had to challenge the low expectations of them as women to be able to coach and prove that they were really able to lead and coach in those organizations. And for these women, they did continue to volunteer in these roles, but for lots of other women, this kind of behavior and discrimination would really put them off. There are also less visible role models for women in traditional sports sectors than in other settings. So the visibility of women in sport generally tends to be quite low historically. So this means that women can often tend to feel a bit isolated and maybe be ascribed less value than some other volunteers. The gendered allocation of roles did come up among parkrun volunteers, so with women generally saying that they would volunteer for the more supportive roles, letting men take on the more leadership roles such as those of run director. And they talked about lack of confidence and wanting to go for these roles. Discrimination and stigma was less obvious in netball, which, as I'm sure you know, is a very female-dominated sport. And then volunteering in the non-sport sector didn't seem to be so divided along gender lines. It was more along kind of shared experiences, whether that be family, socioeconomic status, career status, etc. So family plays a really key motivator and a barrier in terms of women volunteering in sport. So previous research has found that 40% of women volunteering in sport have at least one dependent child, compared to 30% of those volunteering outside of sport. So in our research, we found that both men and women were often involved in traditional sport because of the involvement of their children in that sport. And this was less likely to be the case for other forms of volunteering. And the support of the friends and family can really help to facilitate the women's involvement in the sport. And the presence of a supportive partner who's able to share roles, share childcare, and maybe participate in some events too really helps to encourage and enable the woman to get involved in volunteering. So we know from previous research that actually women can often tend to feel guilty about spending time away from their family and spending time for themselves. So while a family can really help to get a woman volunteering, it can then also present challenges in terms of needing to juggle time commitments, childcare, negotiating responsibilities with other members of the family. And what our research found is that actually being a mother seemed to be more valued in terms of the mass market sports. So in parkrun, it was encouraged that you can turn up with your children, which actually women did find really appealing. So we found that women really value flexible volunteering, and actually a lot of women cited really quite positive experiences being involved in parkrun, much more so than they did with the traditional sports settings. So we believe this is partly about the flexible and really inclusive nature of parkrun. So the women talked about parkrun being really inclusive in terms of both diversity and ability. The nature of the volunteer roles was also slightly different. They were able to choose what they wanted to do. They didn't feel so much time pressure, so they were able to leave their children for a short space of time, go and volunteer, and then it would be over within about an hour. In comparison, the core sports were much less flexible and generally tended to give more and more responsibility to volunteers as time went on. So we've just got a few suggestions that you in your organisations might want to think about in terms of your female volunteers. Since the gendered allocation of roles seem to come up quite regularly, it would be really interesting to audit your own volunteer roles to see if they reflect gender stereotypes. So do the men and women in your organisation tend to fall into certain roles? I think it's also really important to encourage staff and volunteers to attend gender diversity training to make them really aware of what are the issues out there so that they can challenge things in their role as volunteers and as staff members. It's also important to challenge gender stereotypes and discrimination through your communications. So showcase both men and women in a range of roles across your organisation. And in male-dominated sports, this is really important that you show women in roles and have them as case studies, and you're able to promote them as really good volunteers for the rest of the organisation. You can also introduce small changes to try and make your volunteering more family-friendly, maybe encourage events where people are encouraged to bring their family along. enable opportunities for parents to volunteer and spend time with their children. And also, all the time, you should be providing positive images of women with family in your communications. It's also really important to keep an open mind about flexible volunteering roles, so maybe look at new ways of working. So for example, can you change meeting times? Can you share roles? Can you reduce the level of responsibilities for some roles? Or have shorter terms for volunteer roles that make them more inclusive? You might also want to approach women direct to ask if they would be interested in taking on particular roles. Sometimes women do need encouragement to take on that next move. And I think one of the most important things that comes last on this slide, but it is really important, is actually to get to know your own volunteers' motivations and tailor that experience to what they're really interested in. So some women will be motivated by professional development, so they're wanting to learn new skills. For others, it might be about developing networks, it might be making social connections, or it might be about spending time with family. So once you really understand what those motivations are, you can really help to tailor that volunteer experience. So we'll be publishing a report probably in June, so it'll be available on our website then. But in the meantime, do come and talk to me after the presentations, or one of the members of staff from Women in Sport if you've got any questions. Thank you.